Welcome to Puzzle Proof. Join us as we unravel today's captivating story and solve exciting puzzles together. Get ready to engage your mind. Let the journey start. Sherlock Holmes and the Silence Beneath the Veil. Chapter 1. The Letter with No Signature. It was a dismal Tuesday in early November when the post brought an envelope unlike any I had seen before. The fog hung low over London, clinging to windows and dampening every street sound with a peculiar hush. I was seated by the hearth at Baker Street, immersed in a copy of The Lancet, when Holmes, who had until that moment remained motionless upon the sofa, stirred at the rustle of paper in my hand. "It's addressed to you?" I remarked, noting the absence of a return name. "No crest, no stamp, even." "Then it did not arrive through the ordinary channels," Holmes replied, rising with feline grace. He took the envelope delicately between his long fingers, studying it as a jeweller might a rare gem. "Note the ivory hue of the paper, Watson. Black edging, customary for mourning. But this particular stock is rare, handmade, probably German, and the scent, bergamot, subtle but distinct." He withdrew the letter slowly. It contained only 6 words, printed in block capitals with an unsteady hand. "She walks at midnight. Stop her." No name, no location, no date. Nothing but the chilling suggestion of dread and urgency. Holmes said nothing for a moment. Then he held the paper closer to the firelight. "There's an indentation here. Someone wrote a line before this one, then tore the page off and tried again. And look, traces of blotting ink, not from a pen but a hand, nervous, possibly trembling. Do you believe it's a hoax?" "My dear Watson," he murmured, "if someone intended to amuse themselves, they've gone to a curious amount of trouble. The choice of paper alone would suggest cost and care." Just then Mrs. Hudson entered, with her usual gentle knock. "This came by hand, sir," she said, placing a second envelope on the tray. "Left at the door just past 6. The lad who brought it didn't wait." This envelope bore a return address, Thurlow House, Finchley Road, Hampstead. Holmes's eyes brightened. "And the game begins. Watson, I suggest we pay a visit to Finchley Road before the day turns further against us. I have a suspicion the 2 notes are not unrelated." We were soon enveloped by the London fog, our cab weaving through the wet streets with lanterns glowing like watchful eyes. By the time we arrived at Thurlow House, the pale sun was descending behind a veil of cloud, lending the place a ghostly pallor. It was a Victorian structure of impressive size, its upper windows curtained in thick velvet. A wrought iron gate admitted us to a garden overgrown and untended, where ivy clung to walls like a creeping malady. The door was opened by a man in a black suit, thin, silent, and so still he seemed carved from wood. "Mr. Holmes and Dr. Watson," Holmes announced without preamble. "We've been summoned." The butler, whose name we would later learn was Mercer, offered a stiff bow and led us through a series of narrow hallways to a parlour heavy with mourning drapes and the scent of dried flowers. A woman stood at the window, her figure draped in grey silk, her face turned toward the glass. When she turned to greet us, I was struck by the unnatural stillness of her expression, composed but hollow. "I am Mrs. Helena Warrender," she said. "Forgive the abruptness of my invitation. I wasn't sure who else to turn to." Holmes inclined his head. "And yet, you also sent a second unsigned note this morning." She blinked, startled. "I did not. This is the first I've written." Holmes glanced at me but said nothing. Instead, he gestured politely for her to sit. "Madam, if you please, tell us everything. Begin wherever you must." Mrs. Warrender's voice was low and deliberate, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "My late husband, Charles Warrender, passed away 3 months ago. A sudden illness. He was buried here in Hampstead Cemetery, just down the road. Since his death, this house has been strange. In what way? I asked. There are noises at night, the sound of someone walking along the upstairs landing. Objects moved. Once, the bell rang at precisely midnight, though none of us had touched the cord. And then I began to see her. She? Holmes asked, his tone perfectly neutral. She hesitated. A woman, dressed in ivory. Her face always veiled. I've seen her twice, once in the upstairs corridor, once by the parlour hearth. Each time, she vanished the moment I approached. I thought I was losing my mind, but then she stood and crossed to a cabinet. From within, she retrieved a small carved figurine, no taller than a teacup. It depicted a woman in flowing robes, her head covered by a lace veil. One arm was missing, the base was cracked. I found this on the carpet 2 mornings ago. No one knows where it came from. Holmes examined it silently, then placed it back with great care. And you are the sole occupant of the house, madam? My husband's cousin, Mr. Henry Phelps, resides here temporarily, and my companion, Miss Edith Maynard, both were present on the night I last saw the figure. Tell me about Mr. Warrender's death, Holmes said suddenly. He collapsed in his study, she replied quietly. It was thought to be apoplexy. The physician signed the certificate without delay. And did your husband possess any enemies, disputes, unresolved business? She looked surprised. None that I know of. He was a solicitor, rather retiring in manner. At that moment, a sharp knock at the door interrupted us. Mercer entered, carrying a small box. This arrived just now, he said. Left at the gate. Holmes opened the box. Inside was a crushed violet and a folded scrap of parchment. The message read, "At 12, she comes again. This time, she will not be silent." The handwriting was identical to the first letter. Holmes stood at once. "Mrs. Warrender, you must not remain alone in this house tonight. Watson and I shall return before midnight. Keep the doors locked, allow no visitors, and under no circumstances should you enter the parlour after 11 o'clock. But why? Because, madam, Holmes said gravely, I believe your ghost walks in flesh. Chapter 2. Whispers Behind Velvet. It was 9:30 when Holmes and I returned to Baker Street, having left Thurlow House in the deepening mist that clung to Hampstead like a memory that would not be dispelled. Though our carriage jostled and clattered across the cobbled streets, Holmes remained silent, his eyes fixed on some inner geometry of thought. When at last we reached our lodgings, he immediately lit his pipe and began pacing, fingers steepled and brow drawn low. There are threads here, Watson, he said eventually, but they are not yet joined. A veiled figure, a broken figurine, a ghostly hour, and 2 anonymous notes, one of them unsigned, the other falsely claimed. The presence of a falsehood, my dear fellow, is more illuminating than the truth. I poured him a brandy and settled near the fire. You think someone in the house is attempting to frighten Mrs. Warrender? Holmes turned sharply. Frighten? Possibly. Isolate her? Likely. But I suspect this charade is neither simple nor the act of a common trickster. There is calculation here, timing, artistry, and knowledge of her grief. Someone knows her habits intimately. He drew a small notebook from the shelf and began scribbling a rough timeline, muttering under his breath. 3 months since Charles Warrender's death. Apparitions began soon after. Letters arrive, escalating. A figurine placed. A message predicts another appearance. At midnight. He snapped the notebook shut. We must be there to see it ourselves. We returned to Thurlow House shortly before 11. Mercer, the silent butler, opened the door without a word and led us into the parlour, where Mrs. Warrender, dressed in deep mourning, sat flanked by 2 others. One was a tall man of wiry frame, perhaps in his 40s, with a narrow mouth and eyes too sharp to be idle, Mr. Henry Phelps, the cousin. The other was a young woman of pale complexion and even paler disposition, Miss Edith Maynard, the companion. Holmes greeted them cordially. "Thank you for your patience. I ask that no one leave the room after 11 o'clock. The window latches have been secured." "Yes," Mrs. Warrender said softly. "I locked them myself. The French doors as well." Holmes nodded, then addressed Mercer. "Please bring us tea and, one more favour, kindly retrieve any figurines or ornaments resembling the one Mrs. Warrender showed me earlier, from the attic, cellar, or elsewhere." Mercer bowed and vanished. Mr. Phelps sniffed. "I still maintain this is a matter of overwrought nerves. Helena has suffered a tremendous loss. I fail to see what good this performance at midnight will accomplish." Holmes smiled thinly. "A man may carry a violin to silence a scream, Mr. Phelps. What we do now is merely listen for the right note." The clock on the mantelpiece ticked steadily. 10:40. Holmes paced the perimeter of the room, stopping occasionally to examine the wallpaper, the edge of the hearthrug, the grooves beneath the window frame. Miss Maynard sat rigidly, her fingers twisted in her lap. "Miss Maynard," Holmes said suddenly, "what did you observe the last time the apparition appeared?" She startled. I only heard the bell. When I entered the room, Mrs. Warrender was pale and trembling. She claimed to have seen a woman by the fireplace." "You saw no figure yourself?" "No, but I did smell something, powder, like an old dressing room or a theatre." Holmes turned slowly. "Curious, Mrs. Warrender, did your husband keep any theatre acquaintances?" "Number, he was not fond of actors. Though, there was one client, a woman named Vivienne Harrow, a performer of some repute once, but long since retired. She came to see him twice just before he died." "Did she attend the funeral?" Mrs. Warrender looked uncertain. "I don't believe so, but she sent violets, a large wreath." Holmes's eyes glinted. "Of course." The clock chimed 11. A sudden gust of wind tapped against the windows, rattling the panes. Mercer returned, holding a tray. "I found these in a velvet-lined box at the back of the linen cupboard." He revealed 2 more ivory figurines, one cracked, one intact. Both were identical to the first, down to the veil and flowing robes. Holmes examined them without comment, then placed them on the mantel. One figurine broken, one placed deliberately, and now 2 more appear from the shadows. "Watson, what do you make of that?" I frowned. "Someone is planting them, deliberately introducing a symbol to imply something sinister. But why ivory?" "Indeed, why ivory?" Holmes murmured. "Why not marble or porcelain?" We waited in silence. The room felt heavier by the minute, as if time itself had slowed. The fireplace crackled faintly. Outside, a dog barked once, then was still. At precisely midnight, the parlour bell rang. It was a thin, piercing sound, unnatural in its clarity. Mrs. Warrender gasped. Miss Maynard stood abruptly, trembling. Mr. Phelps rose with a start, but Holmes did not move. Instead, he fixed his gaze upon the corridor just beyond the parlour door. Footsteps echoed, light, deliberate, unmistakable. The door creaked open. There, standing in the hall, was a figure clad in ivory robes, face concealed beneath a veil. One pale hand extended toward the doorframe, as though about to enter. Mrs. Warrender shrieked. Miss Maynard covered her mouth. Mr. Phelps bolted for the far wall. Holmes acted instantly. He rushed forward, not toward the figure, but to the floor beneath her. With one swift motion, he pulled back a section of the rug and lifted a square panel of flooring. "Watson, lantern!" I lit the lamp and shone it downward. Beneath the floorboards lay a series of mirror panels, angled perfectly to reflect light from the gas lamp in the hallway. The figure in the doorframe was not there at all. It was a reflection, no more real than a stage illusion. "Gentlemen," Holmes said with satisfaction, "we have been audience to a clever trick." "But the footsteps!" cried Miss Maynard. "Recorded," Holmes said. "A phonograph hidden near the stairwell, operated by timer, no doubt set to the hour. Mercer, if you please, check behind the skirting board." The butler, wide-eyed but composed, did as instructed. Moments later, he produced a concealed cylinder player, its brass gears still faintly warm. Holmes turned to the room. "Now we must ask you who arranged this illusion, and why. Someone here planted that phonograph. Someone placed the figurines. Someone with access, opportunity, and motive." Mr. Phelps swallowed. "Are you accusing one of us?" "No, Mr. Phelps," Holmes said softly. "I am merely observing that ghosts do not place violets on graves, nor do they send letters." He turned to the door. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall pay a visit to Miss Vivian Harrow. I believe she may be the only person who knows why the widow walks at midnight." Chapter 3. The Actress Behind the Veil. The morning after the apparition's illusion had been exposed, Holmes was in a state of quiet exhilaration. Though the events at Thurlow House had disturbed Mrs. Warrender and rattled the nerves of her companions, Holmes was less concerned with their immediate reactions and more fascinated by the intelligence behind the deception. A reflection, a phonograph, a carved figurine. "Watson, it is theatre," he said, as he finished his second cup of coffee. "Someone is directing scenes with deliberate timing and layered meaning. The symbols may be poetic, but the intent is strategic. And I believe the curtain rises next, with Miss Vivian Harrow." It was just after 10 o'clock when we departed for Kensington, where, according to Holmes's inquiries, the once renowned stage actress resided in a modest row house facing Holland Park. The air was crisp, and the city moved briskly under a pale November sky. As our hansom cab rattled through the thoroughfares, Holmes said very little, though he did remove from his coat pocket the broken ivory figurine and turn it slowly in his fingers. "You believe she is the one placing these?" I asked. "I believe Miss Harrow knows more than she has said, if she has said anything at all," Holmes replied. "But more interesting is her connection to Charles Warrender, a man with no known fondness for the dramatic arts." We arrived at the residence in question, a neat, if somewhat faded, red brick building with iron railings and stone steps worn smooth by years of passage. A modest plaque by the doorbell read, "Miss V. Harrow." Holmes rang the bell once, and after a pause, the door was opened by a thin maid of sallow complexion who looked at us with some suspicion. "We wish to speak with Miss Harrow," Holmes said, producing a card. "Please inform her that Sherlock Holmes requests a few minutes of her time regarding a private matter." The girl vanished down the hall and within moments returned with a nod. Miss Harrow awaited us in a drawing-room furnished with rich but aging decor. Heavy curtains blocked much of the daylight, and a faint scent of lavender clung to the air, blending with something more elusive, dust, and perhaps the faint trace of cold tobacco. Miss Harrow herself stood near the fireplace, dressed in a gown of faded plum silk, her silvering hair swept back with care. Her eyes, however, remained arresting, sharp, deep-set, and still accustomed to scrutiny. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending a gloved hand. "And Dr. Watson, I presume? I recall your name from the newspapers. You arrive, I assume, in connection with Charles Warrender. You do not seem surprised to hear it," Holmes replied, bowing. She smiled faintly. "One does not forget the dead, particularly those who leave things unresolved." "Then you believe Mr. Warrender's death was unresolved?" She turned, and for a moment the actress in her emerged, poised, enigmatic. "I believe he kept secret. He was a man of calculated habits, but also, how shall I say it, a man of weakness. We were acquainted some years ago when I sought advice on an inheritance dispute. He handled it with great discretion. We met several times thereafter, though our business had long concluded. And yet, Holmes said, you sent violets to his funeral? She did not flinch. I sent them out of sentiment, not mourning. Violets were the first flowers he ever brought me. I imagine his widow did not appreciate the gesture. She mentioned it, Holmes said calmly. But not your name. Miss Harrow stepped to a cabinet and withdrew a slender case, which she placed on the side table. Opening it revealed a collection of ivory miniatures, including several figurines identical to the ones from Thurlow House. Holmes bent over them with sharp interest. You carved these? I did. It's been a pastime of mine since the stage grew distant. Ivory has texture, grace. It remembers every pressure of the hand. Holmes examined one carefully. This one is missing an arm. I broke it, once, in anger. Because of Charles Warrender? Her hands tensed. Yes. He promised me a small annuity and then retracted it without a word. Said he feared scandal. I told him that ghosts do not fear gossip. Perhaps that stayed with him. Holmes straightened. And did you ever visit Thurlow House? She hesitated. Once. I left a letter. It was returned unopened. After that, I kept my distance. And yet your figurines are now in that house. I did not place them there, she said with quiet force. But if someone wished to imply I had, they would have known precisely how. Holmes regarded her with something close to admiration. You understand theatre, Miss Harrow. You know how to build a character, even a spectral one. She smiled again, though this time there was no warmth. I did not stage a haunting, Mr. Holmes. But if someone is pretending to be me, to unsettle Helena perhaps, it would not be the first time I was used without consent. Holmes inclined his head. You've been very helpful. One final question. Do you know a Mr. Henry Phelps? At this, her expression changed. Yes. He attended some of Charles's functions, a rather theatrical man in his own right, always circling the edge of things. Why? Because he stands at the centre now, Holmes murmured. We departed shortly thereafter. Once outside, Holmes lit a cigarette and walked briskly toward the cab. She's telling the truth, he said. Vivian Harrow is wounded, not scheming. But someone has taken fragments of her life and weaponized them. That someone had access to Warrender's personal effects, letters, perhaps tokens of their relationship, and used them to fabricate this ivory widow. Phelps? I asked. Or someone using Phelps as a diversion. He is too obvious. The bitter cousin, the one with no fortune of his own, too eager to dismiss everything as nonsense. But there is another hand, Watson, the hand that writes anonymous letters, the hand that stages illusions. That hand remains unseen. We returned to Baker Street, where Holmes sat in his armchair with the unbroken figurine balanced on his knee. He turned it gently, then placed it beside his violin. Watson, he said, there is more to this than grief or inheritance. There is performance. Whoever staged that apparition wants Mrs. Warrender frightened, but not to madness, not yet. They want her uncertain, dependent, perhaps even manipulated. To what end? I asked. Holmes stared at the figurine for a long moment. To the end that always justifies cruelty in human affairs, he said. Control. Chapter 4. The Locked Cabinet. The fog that had wrapped London for days lifted by noon the next day, revealing streets slick with yesterday's rain and a brittle chill in the air. Holmes, invigorated by our visit to Miss Harrow, had spent the morning deep in his archives, poring over newspaper clippings and probate records, while I watched from the armchair, my medical journal lying forgotten in my lap. By mid-afternoon, he struck the arm of his chair with sudden decision. Watson, he said, we returned to Thurlow House. There is a cabinet in Charles Warrender's study that I wish to examine. I looked up. A cabinet? Holmes nodded, already reaching for his coat. When I first toured the house, I observed a tall walnut cabinet standing to the left of the writing desk. Its top bore the telltale scratches of a recently displaced item. The pattern suggested something rectangular, like a jewelry case or a document box, had been removed. You believe it holds the key to all this? I believe something was taken from it that should not have been, Holmes replied, adjusting his gloves. And I very much doubt it was taken by the widow. Mrs. Warrender received us in the drawing room, her expression strained but composed. Have you discovered anything further, Mr. Holmes? More questions than answers, he said gently. But may I ask your leave to examine your late husband's study once more? There's a matter I should like to investigate in his effect. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. Of course. The key is in my desk. The study at Thurlow House was a dignified room lined with bookcases and heavy drapes. Dust had begun to settle in the corners, as though the room had resigned itself to absence. Holmes moved quickly, heading straight for the walnut cabinet in the corner. He tested the lock. It held firm. From his breast pocket, he drew a small set of narrow tools and knelt before the lock. Within moments, it clicked open. Inside, a series of files and personal effects lined the shelves, account ledgers, correspondence, a pair of leather-bound journals, and at the back, a velvet-lined tray containing various trinkets, a brass fountain pen, a silver snuff box, and a faded miniature portrait of a young woman in a green dress. Holmes withdrew the portrait and studied it closely. "This is not Helena Warrender," he remarked. "Watson, look at the signature on the back." I took it from him. In delicate ink script it read, "To Charles, always." "V. Vivian Harrow," I said, without question. And what is more intriguing is that Mrs. Warrender told us she never opened this cabinet, so someone else has been here. Holmes continued his search. Behind the ledgers, he uncovered a folder secured with ribbon. Inside were a series of letters, dozens of them, each signed with Vivian's elegant hand. He scanned a few, then returned them. "The tone is affectionate, but cautious," he said. "Not romantic, but not entirely professional either. There was an attachment, but one carefully concealed. Watson, do you recall the incident of the two gardeners and the missing letter?" "You mean the incident in Hounslow?" "Precisely. A man had removed an important letter not to destroy it, but to delay it, buying time while a separate plan unfolded. I believe something similar has occurred here." He turned as the door creaked open. Miss Edith Maynard stood in the doorway, her cheeks flushed. "I'm sorry to intrude," she said quickly. "Mrs. Warrender asked me to bring you this. It's the receipt for the ivory figurine, from when it was purchased." She handed it to Holmes, who unfolded the slip and examined it with interest. "From a shop on Chancery Lane," he murmured. "Not far from the courts." Miss Maynard lingered. Her fingers twisted the edge of her sleeve. "Is there something else, Miss Maynard?" Holmes asked without looking up. She hesitated, glanced at the door, then lowered her voice. "There's something I think you should see, but not here. If you'll come to the morning room." Holmes rose without a word, and we followed her down the hall to a small, sunlit chamber facing the garden. Once inside, she closed the door and drew the curtains, casting the room in a soft, diffused gloom. She moved to a writing desk and removed from its drawer a small wooden box, the lid carved with rosebuds. From within, she produced a torn scrap of parchment and a black silk glove. "These were hidden beneath the floorboards in my room," she whispered. "I found them 2 nights ago, but was afraid to speak. Until now." Holmes took the parchment. The writing was in the same hand as the earlier anonymous notes. "She must not remember. She must not speak. Keep the clock ticking." "And the glove?" Holmes asked. "It's not mine, nor Mrs. Warrender's. I think it's a man's." Holmes turned it inside out. Inside the cuff, in faint white stitching, were the initials H.P. Henry Phelps, Holmes said flatly. "So the cousin has a taste for dramatic flourishes and access to your private rooms." Miss Maynard's voice dropped further. "I heard him once, outside my door. It was past midnight. I pretended to sleep. He didn't enter, but I think he wanted to." Holmes was already moving. "Watson, I must speak with Mr. Phelps. Miss Maynard, thank you. Your discretion may have saved your mistress's peace of mind, and possibly her life." We returned to the hall, where Holmes asked Mercer to summon Phelps to the library. The man arrived with forced calm. "To what do I owe the honor, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes gestured to a chair. "You were close to Mr. Warrender, I understand?" Phelps nodded. "He was my cousin, yes. I served as his legal proxy in a number of minor affairs." "And you had access to his study?" "Of course." Holmes leaned forward. "Then perhaps you can explain why we found one of your gloves hidden beneath Miss Maynard's floorboards, along with a threatening message in the same hand that sent anonymous notes to Mrs. Warrender." Phelps turned pale, his jaw tightening. "I have no idea what you mean. I haven't set foot in her room." Holmes drew from his pocket the glove and held it up. "H.P., unless you share your initials with another member of the household, I suggest you begin explaining." Phelps stood abruptly. "This is absurd. I won't stand to be interrogated in this fashion." "You already are," Holmes said coldly. "And unless I miss my guess, we shall soon find a trail of manipulated accounts and forged documents. You had access to Warrender's cabinet, knew of his connection to Miss Harrow, and sought to torment the widow into submission." "To what end?" I asked. Holmes didn't flinch. "To control her estate. By isolating her, making her believe she was mad, and positioning yourself as the only rational support. You were writing a ghost into existence, not to haunt her, but to possess her fortune." Phelps took a step backward, then another. Holmes's voice was ice. "But there's one piece missing, one step too far, and one truth still buried. For someone else played a role in this illusion, and I intend to discover who." Chapter 5. The Woman Beneath the Portrait. The confrontation with Henry Phelps left Thurlow House shivering in a strange, wordless stillness. Phelps had retreated under protest to his chambers, and Mrs. Warrender, when Holmes informed her of the glove and the note, fell into a distressed silence. She neither doubted Holmes's judgment nor defended her late husband's cousin. The fragile confidence she had once placed in her household had begun to crumble. Holmes, however, showed no signs of triumph. If anything, he grew more absorbed, more exacting in his thoughts, as though the unmasking of Phelps had unveiled not a solution, but another layer of concealment. "The glove connects Phelps to the note," he said, as we left the house late that evening, "but the handwriting itself lacks his manner. There's a rhythm to it, a performer's handwriting, carefully designed for legibility under stage lights. It isn't naturally his." "Then he didn't write the letters?" "On the contrary," Holmes replied, his breath misting in the frosty air. "He likely dictated them. But the hand that shaped the words belongs to someone with theatrical discipline. And I suspect that hand belongs to a woman." "A woman?" I repeated. "Indeed. One who moves quietly through Thurlow House, and whose role in this charade remains deliberately understated." "You mean Miss Maynard?" Holmes's brows rose ever so slightly. "Not necessarily. Miss Maynard may be an instrument, not the composer. No, Watson, we must return tomorrow, but not to question, to search." We arrived early the next morning. Mrs. Warrender was not yet receiving visitors, Mercer told us, but Holmes waved the man aside and made his way directly to the late Mr. Warrender's study. "I've been thinking about that portrait," he said, indicating the miniature of Vivian Harrow, which still rested where we had left it. "Look closely, Watson. Observe the carving on the frame." It was a delicate brass filigree in the shape of ivy leaves, almost too fine to notice unless examined in direct light. "Ivy, symbol of fidelity," Holmes murmured. And yet this piece was hidden in the back of a cabinet. He turned the portrait over once more. "And what of this signature?" "The ink is faded, but note the unevenness of the stroke. Someone attempted to erase part of the inscription. You see here, the initial before the V has been scraped. So it wasn't just V, it was something else. Perhaps another name entirely. We assume the figure in the miniature is Vivian Harrow, but we have no proof beyond the superficial resemblance. What if the woman in the portrait is not Miss Harrow at all?" Holmes stood and crossed to the bookcase beside the writing desk. His eyes scanned the shelves quickly, then locked onto a narrow leather volume tucked at the far end. "Warrender's personal diary," he said, drawing it out with care. "Or so I suspect." He opened it and leafed through the pages, his expression unreadable. "Here we are. October 12th. Edith's concerns grow louder. She fears the consequences if Helena learns of our arrangement." I sat forward. "Edith, Miss Maynard?" "Precisely, but read on. The Ivory Commission was a mistake, too recognizable. I should have destroyed them." Holmes shut the diary with a snap. Warrender was not merely involved with Miss Harrow. He was entangled with Edith Maynard, likely financially, perhaps emotionally, and she in turn has spent the past months tightening her influence over the widow. Consider it, Watson, the placement of figurines, the timing of visions, the management of Helena's day-to-day concerns. Miss Maynard controls the rhythm of this house. We heard soft footsteps approaching. Miss Maynard entered with a tray of tea, her expression carefully neutral. "I didn't expect you so early," she said. Holmes nodded courteously. "Routine is essential in cases such as these. It allows one to observe changes." He took the tray and set it on the sideboard. "You've been most helpful, Miss Maynard. I understand you've been a great comfort to Mrs. Warrender since her husband's passing." "I've done what I can," she said quietly. "Helena is fragile." Holmes smiled faintly. "And do you consider Mr. Phelps to be dangerous?" A flicker passed across her face, the briefest hesitation. "I wouldn't go so far, but I have never trusted him." "Understandable," Holmes replied. "One last question. Do you know who this woman is?" He handed her the miniature. She looked at it, lips parting slightly. "It's Vivian Harrow, surely?" "You're certain?" She hesitated. "Yes, that's what I was told." Holmes took the portrait back. "Then perhaps it's time we ask Mrs. Warrender herself." We found Mrs. Warrender seated in the parlour, her eyes dull with exhaustion. She greeted us with a weak smile but did not rise. "I feel as though I'm caught in someone else's nightmare," she murmured. Holmes sat opposite her and placed the miniature gently on the table between them. "Mrs. Warrender, who is this woman?" She stared at it for a long moment. Then her eyes widened, not with recognition, but with shock. "This is my sister." Watson and I exchanged glances. "I beg your pardon," Holmes said softly but firmly. "My sister Caroline. She died 20 years ago. The resemblance is unmistakable, but this photograph was taken before her illness, when she was still performing. She sang in the opera under the stage name Vivian Harrow." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "So, she and Vivian Harrow are one and the same?" "Yes," she whispered. "But how do you have this?" "Your husband kept it, hidden in his cabinet." And now someone has used her likeness to create a phantom, perhaps to stir your grief, perhaps to manipulate it. Mrs. Warrender buried her face in her hands. He never told me they remained in contact. Holmes's voice was calm. Do you recall how your sister died? She disappeared one evening during a tour of Scotland. Her body was found weeks later near the cliffs of Crail. They said it was a fall, but we never believed it. We thought she had been followed, perhaps by an admirer, or worse. Holmes stood. Thank you, madam. You've given me what I need. I believe this mystery is nearly resolved. Outside in the hallway, Holmes turned to me with the intensity of a violin string under tension. Now we understand the cruelty of this illusion, he said. The ghost of the Ivory Widow was no fiction, it was carefully crafted from the real past. Someone knew about Caroline, about her tragic death, and chose her image to torment Helena, a portrait from decades ago, used as a mask. Then Miss Maynard, not the architect, she was used, Watson, much like Mrs. Warrender. The true culprit is one who knew Caroline's history, who had access to her likeness and Warrender's secrets, and who stood to gain the most from Helena's psychological unraveling. Phelps? Holmes shook his head. Too clumsy. No, we must look further back. Into the Warrenders' circle, a figure who watched, who waited, and who finally made their move under the veil of sorrow. He paused before the stairwell, his eyes gleaming. Tonight, Watson, we return once more to Thurlow House, but not as visitors, as observers in the dark. The final act is approaching, and this time we shall be behind the curtain. Chapter 6. Shadows Behind the Curtain. The fog returned by evening, trailing the edges of the city in its pale, spectral fingers. Holmes stood by the window at Baker Street, his violin in hand, though he did not play. He drew the bow in long, thoughtful motions across the strings, producing no sound, only the ghost of music, suspended in thought. I, seated nearby, had given up my book entirely. The silence between us had become purposeful. At 10:15, he laid the instrument down and turned toward me, his eyes sharp. "Ready, Watson?" I rose without question. By now I had recognized the particular stillness in Holmes that preceded a revelation. He had traced every thread of the case to its fraying point, and now sought only the precise moment to pull. We departed in silence and arrived at Thurlow House under cover of mist and moonlight. Mercer, the ever-watchful butler, let us in with a nod and offered no words as Holmes instructed him to prepare no rooms and inform no one of our presence. "I must insist, Mercer," Holmes said quietly. "If you value your position, you will ensure that neither Miss Maynard nor Mr. Phelps knows of our return this evening." The butler swallowed and bowed stiffly. "Very good, sir." Holmes led me to the back corridor of the house, where the shadows lay thick against the floorboards, and the air tasted faintly of mildew and old varnish. He opened a narrow door near the scullery, revealing a servant's stairway that spiraled upward, little used and cloaked in dust. "We watch from the study tonight," he whispered. "There is a view to the parlour through the transom, no more than a sliver but enough. I suspect tonight's performance will not be for the household. It will be for someone else." We took our position in the dark study. The fire had long since died, and the only light was the faint glow of a lamp from the hallway. Through the transom window above the doorframe, we had a clear view of the parlour's far end, just enough to see the hearth, the armchair, and part of the adjoining wall where the ivory figurines had been found. Holmes crouched beside me. "If I'm correct," he murmured, "someone will come not to haunt, but to recover something. A final act in their little play, and a misstep, I trust." Time passed slowly. The house lay silent, but not still. Faint creaks echoed overhead, and once A clock in a distant room chimed 11. I glanced at Holmes. His eyes were fixed on the gap in the doorframe, like a man watching the hour hand of a bomb. Then, movement. A faint figure appeared in the corridor outside the parlour. It paused, glancing back over its shoulder. Slender, gloved, dressed in a long cloak and bonnet. It slipped into the parlour and shut the door behind it without sound. Holmes tensed beside me, his hand slowly closing around the handle of his walking stick. The figure moved into the hearth and bent low, lifting the edge of the rug. There, just as Holmes had once done, it found the hidden floor panel. But unlike our earlier examination, this time the intruder reached further, removing something small, a wrapped bundle, and slipping it into a satchel at the hip. "Not a ghost," Holmes whispered. "A thief." Before the figure could turn, Holmes was up and through the door with startling speed. I followed close behind. By the time I reached the parlour, Holmes had already pulled the shawl from the intruder's shoulders, revealing a pale face beneath the bonnet. Miss Edith Maynard. She gasped, but did not cry out. The expression on her face was not one of fear, but exhaustion. "I wondered how long it would take you," she said bitterly. Holmes stepped back. "So you admit it then?" "I was never meant to, but I'm too tired for lies now." I stared at her in disbelief. "You? But you told us you were afraid of Phelps, that you suspected him of orchestrating all of this." She gave a sad, brittle smile. "He was a distraction. The perfect one, in fact. Arrogant, eager, always hanging about with veiled opinions and obvious ambition. He never knew he was part of the story." Holmes spoke coolly. "And the story, Miss Maynard, was written by you." She looked at him with a weary kind of pride. "Yes, I wrote it. I staged the midnight hauntings, planted the figurines, forged the notes. I even copied my own handwriting with my left hand to confuse you." "Why?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Why go to such lengths to torment the woman who trusted you?" She turned to me slowly, her eyes heavy with unspoken truths. "Because Helena stole everything from me. My future. My name, my sisterhood." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Your sisterhood?" She nodded. "Caroline was my sister. Yes, my sister. Not Helena's. Caroline was taken in by the Warrenders when she was 10, after our mother died. They gave her a new name, new clothes, a new life. I was left behind with an uncle who drank and beat us both. Helena called her sister because it was convenient, but I knew Caroline before she ever stepped foot on an opera stage." "You resented them." "I loved her," Miss Maynard snapped. "I watched her vanish into their world of wealth and refinement. And when she died, when no one even sought to find her killer, I promised myself I'd bring them down, every one of them. And Charles Warrender, he knew. He knew she'd been followed. He knew it wasn't an accident. But he buried it, for reputation, for silence. So he kept her portrait, locked away, and married Helena instead." Her voice cracked just once. "I only wanted the truth seen. If Helena couldn't recognize Caroline's face after all these years, she didn't deserve to call herself her sister." Holmes looked at her evenly. "And the bundle you just took from beneath the floor?" She handed it over without protest. Inside were old letters, tied with red ribbon, and a single dried violet. One letter bore a broken wax seal marked C.W. They were Caroline's. She said, "Letters to Charles, letters he never answered. I wanted them. I needed them to show how deep his cowardice ran. I opened one and skimmed the contents. It was tender, emotional, and increasingly desperate. The last line read, 'If you cannot meet me at Crail, I shall go alone.'" Holmes folded the letter. "You staged a ghost to reveal a silence." She looked away. Helena was never the ghost. I was." He studied her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You shall have to answer for the staging and for the deceit, but you shall not answer alone." Phelps may not have authored this performance, but he was no innocent. He tampered with ledgers and whispered doubts where they'd do the most harm. She nodded. "I used him. He never suspected I was capable." Holmes turned to me. "Watson, I shall write to Inspector Lestrade. There is much to explain, but I doubt the law will treat this as malice. It is a case of grief carried too long in silence, and of truth buried, like everything else in this house, beneath the floorboards." Miss Maynard gave no further protest as we prepared to leave. At the parlour door, she looked back once more at the miniature on the mantelpiece. "She was more than a ghost," she whispered. "She was the only one who ever sang to me." Chapter 7. The Violet Confession. Miss Maynard's confession marked the beginning of the end, but not the resolution Holmes sought. The mystery, though unmasked in form, still held a deeper chamber. The letters recovered from beneath the parlour floor revealed sorrow and desperation, but no criminal conspiracy. The phonograph and mirror illusions spoke of theatrical cunning, not violence. There was still the unanswered death of Caroline, Vivian Harrow, and the faint scent of unburied truth. "She did not do it all alone," Holmes said to me the next morning as we sat over breakfast. "No woman devises that degree of technical precision without assistance, nor does she source a military-grade timing mechanism by wandering into a shop on the Strand." I poured him coffee, watching him with interest. "You believe someone aided her?" He nodded. "Indeed, someone who knew of her plans and used them for their own gain. A hidden accomplice, or perhaps a saboteur." At that moment, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a telegram. Holmes took it, read it swiftly, then passed it to me. "From Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard. Subject: warrant for Phelps, fraudulent transfer of assets. Discovered trail leads to bank in Charing Cross. Request meeting L." "Phelps," I said. So he was manipulating more than just sympathy. "He had no hand in the ghostly theatrics," Holmes replied. "But while Miss Maynard wove illusions in the drawing room, Phelps was busy in the ledger room. He forged Helena's signature to transfer a portion of her late husband's investments to a private account." "Bold," I remarked. "Foolish," Holmes corrected. He assumed she would eventually be institutionalized or made to believe herself unfit to manage her affairs. In either case, he positioned himself as next of kin and guardian. And yet, I mused, he underestimated Maynard. "As most do when it comes to grief," Holmes said softly. "We met Lestrade at the bank in Charing Cross, a modest building with marble floors and suspiciously polite clerks. The inspector was already waiting in a rear chamber, a small pile of documents spread across the table before him. Lestrade stood as we entered, offering Holmes a firm nod. "Thought you'd want to see this for yourself," he said. Phelps used a forged authorization to access Warrender's dormant investment account. Transferred the funds gradually over the past month. Small amounts, just under reporting thresholds. Clever, but not clever enough. Holmes scanned the documents with interest, pausing at one particular slip. "This signature? It matches the one on the legal declaration of illness filed for Mrs. Warrender 2 weeks ago." Lestrade looked up. He was trying to have her committed. Holmes tapped the page. Yes, if she were declared unfit, he could assume control of the estate. Maynard's illusions served him well, even if she never intended them for that purpose. Lestrade shook his head. "It's a tangled web, this one." "And yet," Holmes murmured, "it lacks its final thread. The matter of Caroline's death remains unsolved. Miss Maynard believed her sister was followed, perhaps silenced. That assumption has not yet been disproved." Lestrade frowned. The local constable in Crail marked it as a fall. No signs of foul play, no bruising or struggle noted in the coroner's notes. Coroners, Holmes said, often fail to account for motive. Later that afternoon, we paid a final visit to Thurlow House. Phelps had been arrested quietly that morning, removed with little protest. Helena Warrender, now fully informed of both his crimes and Miss Maynard's tragic motivations, sat quietly in the parlour when we arrived. Holmes approached her with careful courtesy. "There is one thing more, Mrs. Warrender. It concerns your sister's death." She met his gaze, her composure fragile but dignified. "You believe there was foul play?" "I believe she met with someone that night in Crail, not Charles, but someone else. Someone she trusted, or at least recognized." Holmes produced the final letter Caroline had written, found among the bundle Maynard recovered. He handed it to Helena. She read it slowly, lips pressed tightly. Then she looked up, face pale. "This handwriting." "Yes?" "It's been altered. This is not her usual hand." Holmes leaned forward. "Would you say it was dictated?" "Yes." Caroline wrote fluidly, poetically. "This is stilted, composed under pressure." Holmes took the letter back. "And the seal?" Helena looked at it. "That's not Charles's. It's my father's." Watson and I turned in unison. "Your father's? Or—" Holmes spoke quietly. "A man who controlled Caroline's life in her youth. A man who took her in, but not out of love. Tell me, did your father ever approve of her career on the stage?" "No," Helena said at once. "He hated it. He said she was embarrassing the family name. He wanted her to marry." Holmes nodded. "Then I believe the answer lies there, not in who loved Caroline, but in who feared her independence." We left the house shortly after, the last echoes of tragedy fading into the dusk. That evening, back in our quarters at Baker Street, Holmes stood by the fire and pulled from his coat a small envelope, one I had not seen him acquire. "This," he said, handing it to me, "was hidden beneath the lining of Caroline's final letter." I opened it carefully. Inside was a pressed violet, and a note written in a trembling but elegant hand. "If I disappear, I pray you remember me not as a ghost, but as a woman who wished to sing her own song." See, I felt a chill then, not of cold, but of sadness. Holmes stared into the flames. She died that night, not because of a lover's quarrel or romantic tragedy, but because she chose to defy a world that could not accept her. Someone, perhaps her guardian, met her at Crail and ensured she would never perform again. "Do you think we'll ever know who it was?" "No," Holmes said, "but we now know why, and sometimes, Watson, the why must suffice when the who is long buried." I said nothing. Outside, the fog pressed softly against the windows. Somewhere, a violin was being tuned, a quiet, sombre note. Holmes reached for his own and played a single line, low, mournful and sweet. "The Song of a Woman Remembered." Chapter 8. The Final Note. A week had passed since the events at Thurlow House began to unspool, thread by thread, into the public eye. The morning newspapers carried restrained headlines: "Society widow victim of estate fraud, cousin arrested in financial scandal, phantom haunting proven hoax," but none dared touch the tragic poetry of what Holmes and I had uncovered in silence. The ghostly figure who had walked at midnight no longer stirred the curtains at Hampstead. The ivory widow had been returned to the cabinet of memory, and the house, once echoing with performance and grief, had fallen back into a curious hush. Only the truth remained, and even that was a muted melody heard by few. Holmes sat in quiet contemplation as I set down my teacup. His gaze was fixed not on the street below or the embers in the grate, but on the single object resting on the table between us, a pressed violet, dry and paper-thin, the same one found inside Caroline's final note. "You have been uncharacteristically still," I said, finally breaking the silence. Holmes nodded. "Because the conclusion, though inevitable, is one I find difficult to admire. This case was not won through brilliance or force, Watson, but through the slow peeling away of masks. What we discovered was not a singular villain, but a chorus of errors." He stood, drawing aside the curtain and looking out into the thinning fog. Maynard sought revenge cloaked in mourning, but her intent was not cruelty, it was longing. Phelps coveted wealth, yet lacked the nerve to seize it cleanly. And Warrender, he was neither hero nor scoundrel, merely a man too weak to honor the love that once crossed his path. I was silent, letting his thoughts stretch the space between us. Then came a knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with her usual composure, but there was a softness in her tone I had come to recognize as rare concern. "A visitor, Mr. Holmes, Mrs. Warrender." Holmes glanced at me, then nodded. "Show her in." Helena Warrender entered not as the trembling widow we had first encountered, but with the bearing of someone who had endured pain and come out not unscarred, but standing. She wore a dark blue dress trimmed with silver thread, and her mourning veil had been replaced by a simple hat. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I hope I'm not intruding." "Never, madam," Holmes said, gesturing to the seat by the fire. "May we offer you tea?" She shook her head gently. "No, thank you. I only wish to speak with you before I leave London." "You're leaving?" "Yes. The house is no longer mine, not truly. I've arranged to spend some months in the country. My husband's memory deserves quiet, free of ghosts and shame." Holmes inclined his head. "That is wise. I trust the legal matters have been resolved." "Mr. Phelps has confessed," she said quietly. "His accounts were frozen and the funds returned. As for Miss Maynard, she has been committed to a private sanatorium near Bath, not as punishment, but for rest. Her mind was frayed long before the ivory widow ever walked." "She loved your sister deeply," Holmes said. "Perhaps more than she ever admitted to herself." A flicker of sadness crossed her face. "Caroline was never easy to understand. She lived by her own music. I realize now that I never truly knew her. I called her sister because that was what society accepted, but I treated her as a guest in our lives, a beautiful, fragile guest." "You were both caught in a play neither of you wrote," Holmes said gently. Helena turned her eyes to the violet on the table. "She used to press them," she murmured. "Caroline. In old novels, she said violets were the only flower that didn't beg for attention." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small envelope, much like the one that had started this mystery. "This came yesterday," she said, handing it to Holmes. "No name, no return, just the same ivory paper." Holmes opened it. Inside was a single sentence, written in Caroline's unmistakable hand. "Forgive those who bury you with silence." Beneath it, a second line had been added, this one written recently. "You were never forgotten, E.M." Holmes read it aloud and set the note down slowly. "She wrote that?" I asked. Helena nodded. "Before Caroline left for Scotland, I found it among some old books yesterday. Maynard must have taken it, then returned it once she knew I understood." Holmes was silent a long moment. "I've solved 100 cases, Mrs. Warrender," he said finally. "Many of them filled with cunning and wickedness, but this one will stay with me. Not for its danger, but for its sorrow. It was a mystery of silence and longing, not crime." Helena rose. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes, for not treating it like a mere puzzle, for seeing what lay beneath it." She offered him a small nod, then turned to me. "And thank you, Dr. Watson." Your kindness kept my fear from consuming me." With that, she left us, her steps calm, the weight lifted, if only slightly. That evening, Holmes resumed his violin. But the piece he played was different, softer, without his usual precision. He paused midway through a melancholy phrase and set the instrument aside. "I sometimes wonder," he said suddenly, "if ghosts exist not in the supernatural, but in the choices we do not make, the paths we do not follow." He stood, crossed to the fireplace, and placed the pressed violet upon the mantel. "Caroline chose freedom, Watson, and it killed her. Maynard chose vengeance, and it devoured her. Helena chose dignity, and it nearly broke her. 3 women, each seeking to be heard in a world too fond of silence." I said nothing for a long time. Then I stood beside him. "And you?" I asked. "What do you choose, Holmes?" He looked at me, a rare flicker of weariness in his eyes. "I choose to remember them." Outside, the fog lifted, and with it the story of the Ivory Widow came to an end, not with accusation or applause, but with understanding.